Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, namaskar. Let me welcome all of you to yet another edition of Cradle webinar series. We are back once again with yet another intriguing and insightful topic and an absorbing, thought-provoking discussion. As you know, Cradle webinar series makes an attempt to dive into the complexities of our nature, our inner being, our world. Cradle webinar series attempts to answer questions that have not been answered so far. It tries to resolve riddles, problems, and complexities that are troubling the mankind since times immemorial. We have today a very interesting topic. Today, we're going to talk about science and spirituality. All of us know that 13.8 billion years ago, the universe was created. That's what science tells us. Science tells us that the earth came into existence about 4.7 billion years ago. It tells us that life came into existence about 3.7 billion years ago. It says human beings came into existence probably 200,000 years ago. Science tells us when the universe was created. It tells us when the earth came into existence. It tells us when life came into existence on the earth. It tells us when human life came into existence. It doesn't tell us why life came into the universe, why human life had a beginning, what is the purpose of human life, where were we before, where we shall be after this life. And there are hundreds and thousands of questions that science has failed to answer. Does spirituality answer these questions? We don't know. To find answer to that $1 million question, we have a very eminent personality with us today. He is a scientist himself, an academician, an educationalist, and also a spiritual practitioner. So probably here is a man who brings or who has experienced the best of both the worlds. He is none other than Professor Dr. Sutanu Chakrabarti, Professor, Indian Institute of Technology, Chennai. Can we have the guest on our screen, please?
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mr. Surya Prakash Mahapatra, for the introduction.
Thank you, Professor Chakrabarti, and welcome to the Cradle Fireside Chat. We're extremely happy and delighted to have you with us today. And I have already talked about, I have given an intro to the topic that we have today, a very, very interesting, intriguing topic. And we couldn't have imagined a better panelist, expert on our panel today to talk about this topic and answer some questions that all of us are trying to find answers to. Welcome once again, Professor Chakrabarti, to the Cradle webinar series. And today we're going to talk about science and spirituality. Professor Chakrabarti, we know that science has a noble mission. We also know that spirituality has a noble mission. But do they find a common ground? Do they have a common objective? Do they converge anywhere? If at all, if that is the case, where do science and spirituality meet?
Uh, Thank you, Mr. Mahapatra, for your question. I think it's very pertinent, and many of us have a similar kind of an issue bogging us. And so, first of all, we get started with the goal of science. One of the important things that science does is observe nature and try to ask questions about why nature behaves the way it does. So one of the important things about science is about forming hypotheses, coming up with hypotheses about why nature behaves the way it does, and to systematically test these hypotheses, and then perhaps arrive at laws that explain nature. Now, if we expand the scope of science to also cover the totality of our being, we soon find the meeting ground between science and spirituality. Just to take a simple example, if we look at the night sky, we see that the moon is big and the stars are small. But science tells us that it is otherwise. Similarly, if we look at our own little lives, we find that we sometimes have distorted views of what is important and what is not. Sometimes the faults of others appear big, and the faults of our own inner being appear small. So we sometimes have our priorities inverted, because of which we have confusion in our life. So the role of spirituality is exactly the same as science in this case. It has to dispel the illusion and situate us in the right perspective. Just to take another example, one point in the history of science, we used to believe that the Earth is at the center of the world. And then we had the Copernican revolution. And this was followed by several other developments from Kepler, Newton, and so on. And we now have Copernicus, for example, came up with the heliocentric view, which was later revised by Newton and others. So we now have a very different picture that the Earth is not the center of the world, something else is. And similarly, in our own little lives, we have our egoistic propensities at the center, and we tend to regulate our lives driven by them. And soon we enter into roadblocks, which we need to get or free ourselves of. And then we seek recourse to something else that should be the center of our life instead. If we take Sri Sri Thakur Anukul Chandra, the central element of his teaching is be concentric. And when ideal becomes the center of our life, we begin to see things in the true perspective. As a third example, we find that most of engineering that we do is essentially based on science. So if we have thermodynamics and the laws of thermodynamics, these go into the building of our air conditioners or refrigerators. Similarly, the Newton's laws forms the basis for engineering of bridges or buildings or whatever. Similarly, we find that we need an understanding of the fundamental principles of our being and our interrelatedness with the rest of the universe that can provide the basis for engineering of man, which was Sri Sri Thakur's main mission. He wanted a man-making institution, and for that it was imperative that we understand the foundations of what it takes to be an ideal man. I think the most compelling intersection of science and spirituality happened in the history of mankind, in Sri Sri Thakur's own words, where he said, the ideas and activities that lead man towards the cause are spiritualism. So in that sense, both science and spiritualism have the same goal, to lead us towards the cause. There is a subtle distinction which essentially is important to point out here, because the natural question then is, why can't we have science alone? Why do we need something like spirituality? The reason is, I think, we have two different kinds of doubts in science. The first is cognitive doubt. The second is existential doubt. Cognitive doubt comes from the fact that in science, we know that there is no particular theory that's written on the rock. It's not solidified. So Newton's laws, for example, had to give way to Einsteinian picture of the world and so on. So science definitely cannot conclude with certainty that whatever it has postulated about the nature of the world is indeed the way nature actually works. And that is the source of cognitive doubt, the incompleteness, because we have not designed this world. There's the second kind of doubt, the existential doubt, which is more to do with why are we here? What is the purpose of our creation? And so on. This was beautifully articulated by Peter Medawar, who had written a book, Advice to a Young Scientist, where he says the existence of a limit to science is, however, made clear by its inability to answer childlike elementary questions having to do with with first and last things. Questions such as how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? There was a scientist by the name of John Polkinghorne who illustrated this very beautifully when he said that if there is a kettle full of water boiling in the kitchen, and if we ask, why is the water boiling? There is this scientific answer that water is boiling because the molecules of water are essentially moving farther away from each other. But then there is the more immediate and compelling reason, which is the water is boiling because I want a cup of tea, which is the everyday answer that we are looking for. Now, the fact the water is boiling for tea is something that is inaccessible to science, but that is the question of ultimate cause. So science essentially does not have to do with meaning. It deals with mechanism, and it does not have access to the ultimate cause, which is where the role of spirituality really comes in. So I think that summarizes my answer to your question.
Wonderful. I think you talked about science, you talked about spirituality, you talked about the distinction, and beautifully explained with brilliant examples. And I'm really impressed with your response. Building on this on this question, my next question would be: is there a rational basis for faith at all? Scientists, do they believe in faith? And do rationalists believe in faith? Is there a rational basis for faith at all?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mahapatra, for the second question. I think the issue of faith is important because I think that's where a lot of confusion really is between science and spirituality. And if we really look at our childhood, we started learning the alphabet, the letters A, B, C, for instance. And we were basically asked in kindergarten to write A 10 times, B 10 times, and we just followed it and got to learn the alphabet. The meaning of why we actually did what we did came on much later. So we found later on that the letters C, A, and T could be put together to form cat, which can refer to something outside us, something that can convey some meaning and help us articulate something about the world. So we essentially started the very journey of education through faith on our teachers or our parents, and so on. So it's kind of unfortunate that later down the line, we tend to ignore the role of faith, without which we would have remained illiterate. So the main reason why faith is important and why it does have a rational basis is that if you start thinking about it, we have these passionate complexes that essentially prevent us from seeing the world as it actually is. And if we really need to see the world with clarity, we need to know something about our guru or the ideal who can essentially pave the way for regulation of our inner complexes. But then, in order to recognize the guru, we require to have clarity of vision, right? So for clarity, we need guru, but for understanding our guru, we need clarity, and we'll end up in some kind of circularity. And that is the mess we need to free ourselves from. And there is no easy way out of the circularity. We need to have a seed element of faith to essentially free ourselves of this circularity. And this is indispensable for any process of education, right? And this is well known that without this element of faith, this seed element of faith, no process of education can essentially be started. Scientists recognize this because all science essentially rests on faith, right? There are essentially three different kinds of faith that form the basis for science. One is uniformity, the second is intelligibility, and the third is rationality. Uniformity has to do with the fact that we really believe that we have to believe that nature is uniform. There is absolutely no reason for nature to be uniform, but we have to believe that it is indeed uniform to make any advance in science whatsoever. So otherwise, we would be perpetually paranoid about boarding an aeroplane or taking a drug, right? So I need to have faith in the uniformity of nature for that. The second is intelligibility, which means that we have faith that nature can actually be understood by us. And again, there is no holy grail reason why that should be true, right? It could well be that nature is not actually understandable, but then we need to have a faith in that as well. And it is amenable to our methods of reason, which is the third metaphysical assumption, the assumption of rationality. So all these three metaphysical assumptions cannot essentially be proved by science per se, but these have to be taken for granted if any advancement has to be made. And I think the very fact that scientists are aware of this, and essentially they know that without this particular element of faith, it's meaningless to talk about any further developments. I think, is testimony to the fact that, in fact, faith has to be rational.
Oh, this is interesting. Faith has to be rational. And he talked about the three types of faith that scientists need to rely on, in their journey. I think this is really, really interesting. And he also talked about accepting the guru to have clarity. It's really a delight to hear about accepting a guru in life from a scientist like you, because I know that there are many rationalists, scientists, who do not have faith in God, do not have faith in the so-called living ideal, spiritual guide, and so on. So, if faith has a rational basis, Dr. Chakrabarti, why then the so-called scientists display a sense of aversion towards faith? What's the reason for that?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mahapatra, again. Again, a very relevant question, I think, to the current thread. I suppose the central point, which essentially creates a lot of confusion, is a lack of appreciation of the limits of intellect and limits of language, right? Intellect often manifests itself through language. And intellect has this nature of discriminating. It cannot but discriminate between X and the negation of X. And this is also the property of language. And often we essentially get too much tied up in what can be done in the confines of language, when it is obviously known that language itself has its limits. Our Acharya Dev, Sri Sri Dada, had once just mentioned in the passing a very beautiful and very compelling example. He said, if you taste rasgulla, which is a sweetmeat popular in Eastern India, with Bengalis in particular, then you cannot communicate the taste of a rasgulla to another person. You have to feed him or her a rasgulla to communicate that, which essentially points to the fact that language is limited in what it can and cannot do. Language essentially came from marketplace needs, which means I go to a shopkeeper, I say I want 5 mangoes, you give me 5 mangoes. And this is what language is good at. It obviously, as the rasgulla example shows, even for conveying very limited aspects of our worlds of experience, it essentially falls short. In philosophy, we had very formal ways of approaching this problem. So Kurt Gödel, for example, in the last century, came up with the incompleteness theorems, where he essentially demonstrated the limits of logic. And he said that you could have a sentence like, the details of his proofs are obviously beyond the scope of this discussion. But if you just take a sentence like, this sentence is false, it's easy to see that, you cannot either say the sentence, if it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's true. So you'll end up in some kind of paradox, right? A circularity. And you cannot get out of it, which means that you cannot assign truth values to all sentences in logic, especially self-referential ones, those that talk about themselves, for example, this sentence. Later down the line, there was this philosopher, Wittgenstein, who came up with a formal proof that language is limited. And his argument was something like this. If you have a word like apple, it does point to something like apple, right? As we know, the fruit. But the relationship or the binding of the symbol to the actual object that it refers to is not contained within the language. So you require a second language to essentially express this binding. And this second language also has the same limitation, that it does not contain in itself the binding of its symbols to what they actually refer. So these are typically called signifier and signified. So the binding between the signifier and signified is not contained in that second language either, and therefore require a third. And it keeps on going, right, in an infinite recurse. So you can essentially establish that there is no end to the process, and therefore no language essentially is self-contained. But all our conflicts, all our arguments essentially are coming because we take language to be self-contained. When someone says, I'm an atheist, I'm an agnostic, or I'm a believer, they could essentially surprisingly have the same world of experiences inside, but they're just communicating using different words. Just like, I say it is day here and someone in the US says it's night, and we never have an argument because we know about the nature of the reality, how Earth really is, and we stop fighting about that. Similarly, once we know that, have access to the world of experiences, then we stop fighting over language or linguistic constructs. Similarly, if we take a small child, the child might have heard from her parents that the movie Titanic is romantic, and she might be having a kind of argument with her friend who is also in kindergarten, who says that it's tragic because that's what she heard from her parents. But both of them are fighting, but none of them have experienced to the movie Titanic, right? When they grow up, they realize that it was a silly fight after all, and Titanic could both be romantic as well as tragic. So the whole idea that is important here is to say that we have to understand that there are formal proofs about limits of language, but no such limits exist in the world of experiences. And all the truth essentially is about getting deeper into the world of experiences. Just as a finger pointing to the moon should not be mistaken as the moon itself, our words should not be mistaken for the experiences they essentially point to. I would just end with a quote by Heisenberg, who many of you know was one of the biggest people in the world of quantum physics. And he says, the first gulp from the glass of natural sciences will turn you into an atheist, but at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. So that exactly is the point when he landed up in issues relating to particle versus wave and so on. Exactly the same kind of dilemma was there, which came from experiences, that we were thinking about particles and waves, and we had some inbuilt connotations, but that was not what reality was. And in the world of mathematics, some of these distinctions never held water. So I think that is one of the main reasons why a lot of confusion really happens.
Professor Chakravarti, I think your narration reminds me of a story that I read in my childhood. A teacher who took 5 of his blind students to show them an elephant, and 5 of them, went to there, saw the elephant, touched the elephant, tried to feel the elephant, and they came back, and each one of them described the elephant very differently. One said elephant is like a pillar, another said it's like a rope, another said it is like a snake, and so on. So I think our vision of the world is limited, or the way we see the world is limited by our vision. I think it's the clarity of vision that is important, and that probably comes from spirituality. I think it's a great discussion, and you were talking about atheists, non-believers, and you did mention the quotation or the statements of Sri Thakur Ankul Chandra. I think he has said that it really doesn't matter whether you believe in God or not. Do you have existence? As long as you live, you have your existence. If you have your existence, you also have the source of your existence. So I think that's important. Knowing the source, trying to know the source, trying to identify, trying to find, trying to understand, trying to experience the source. I think that's what spirituality is all about. Whether you believe in science, don't believe in science, that really doesn't matter. I think to continue with this discussion, I would like to ask you, because we talked about Sri Sri Thakur and Kul Chandra. What, according to Sri Sri Thakur and Kul Chandra, is the true purpose of science?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mahapatra, for the question. Um the answer is in two parts. Um or rather, the answer as I see it is in two parts. The first is the individual appeal of science as Sri Sri Thakur saw it, so at an individual level, and the second is at a collective or a societal level. And at an individual level, I think Sri Thakur's biggest emphasis was on the fact that we should have a rational outlook towards life. And this is something that he wanted every person to essentially imbibe. And he was essentially uncompromising in that, right? You were just mentioning about Sri Sri Thakur's idea regarding faith. And what Sri Thakur said is that, given that I think earlier in the discussion we saw that faith is indispensable because otherwise we can't break out of the circularity, Sri Thakur's uniqueness was that he said that this component of faith should be minimal and should be appealing to every rational human being. And he said that, therefore, we should take something which is appealing to all of us. We don't need to believe in any god of skies, any fanciful concoctions. We just need to believe that we like to exist and we like to grow, right? So being and becoming. And all animate beings shared that. And if we just have faith in just this much, we can accept Sri Sri Thakur as our living ideal. And this is the most important thing that he wanted to convey, that you should have a rational outlook. And I think we should also appreciate that in the societal context that existed at that point in time, it was revolutionary. For Sri Sri Thakur wanted people to come out of all of these notions of God of skies coming to kind of rescue at a time when they actually needed help, and this notion of miracles. And Sri Sri Thakur essentially categorically said that anything that I do not know the cause of, it appears to me as a miracle. He was talking to a person who was, I think, a reporter, and he said that, for me, shorthand might appear as a miracle because I don't know it, but for you, it doesn't. So again, this strong affinity towards cause, something that he wanted everyone to imbibe, was something that was radical about Sri Sri Thakur. Almost every question had a rational answer for him. Someone asked him, why should anyone help anyone else? And Sri Sri Thakur said that just look at your finger, at your hand. And when a mosquito sits on your forehead, your hand goes and drives away the mosquito. And the forehead doesn't give back anything in return. Whenever we think of rationality, we think about utility. What did I gain out of it? So, but the next time the mosquito sits on the forehead, again the hand goes and drives away, though it receives nothing from the forehead. So it appears irrational to my eye, but at a certain perspective, if you really look at it, the hand remains situated in the conviction that it has no existence outside the entire body. And similarly, as human beings, when we elevate ourselves to the realization that we are interconnected, then it becomes rational for us to reach out to others and help them. So this was the kind of answer that Sri Sri Thakur used to provide. And in his childhood, we see numerous incidents which were kind of pretty interesting. So when he was in school, for instance, his school teacher taught him 1 + 1 is 2, and he kind of said, no, that can't be true. No two things in the world are the same. So 1 + 1 can at best be 2 once, but never 2. And he was beaten up for that mercilessly. But later down the line, we now see that there is Leibniz, who came up with the identity of indiscernibles, which exactly says the same thing, that there are no two identical objects, right? Leibniz actually faced some criticism for this as well, but right now it is treated as something invincible. In fact, it is known that even if two objects are identical in all attributes, they actually cannot occupy the same point in space, and therefore they cannot be identical. So, but this particular philosophical truth appeared to Sri Sri Thakur at young childhood. And similarly, Sri Sri Thakur invented the fountain pen. So all of these were kind of demonstrations that we need to free ourselves of this mindset where we kind of take things for granted, right? And Sri Sri Thakur rather focused our attention to things related to health, to hygiene, to cleanliness, the right practice of medicine, for instance. When it comes to medicine, again, we find a very different conception. I mean, he extended this notion of medicine to even curing of ailments, which we sometimes find hard to tolerate. Like there were people like criminals and wrongdoers who came to Sri Sri Thakur, and Sri Sri Thakur said that, you know, just as we do not have a sense of hatred or detestation towards a disease, we should not have hatred or detestation towards sin. We should try to kind of do everything towards sin. We should just try to eradicate it in the same way. And we should have no notion of detesting the person himself. And we see a lot of that also in the way he pictured economy, the way he pictured society as a whole. And I think even in his education, we find that interconnectedness, the sense of organic belongingness, that we as individuals are essentially part of this system, just as cells are tied together in the human body, all of that forming a very central basis for many of his things. So in some sense, Sri Thakur wanted to tell people that I am not here to essentially make you subordinates to me so that you always look up to me for assistance. But at the very beginning of Satyanusaran, he clarifies that the goal is to awaken mastery in you so that you can see things as they really are. And if you do not make effort to awaken this mastery, then all of this is essentially meaningless. And I think no spiritual being ever in the history of the mankind has been so emphatic about the rational basis of spirituality as Sri Sri Thakur has been. The second part of it, which is about the social context and the normative emphasis of science, which was very important for Sri Sri Thakur, he goes on to essentially clarify that how people of the country can remain well, how their health can improve, how the country can become richer in wealth, how a nation weak physically can be strengthened scientifically, should be the objective of scientific research. I've taken this quote from the book, The Benign Lot. And just to kind of make sure that people really get their focus right, he actually started a science laboratory. And there was this powerhouse with oil engines and dynamics, the mechanical workshop, the chemical workshop, the art studio, engineering works, and various new medicines were invented from indigenous herbs and so on. Now, this is something that we have absolutely no precedence of in the history of spirituality ever in this planet. I mean, this is for the first time we see this. And I think this is remarkable. And we just can't bow down to that. The strong sense of perception that Sri Sri Thakur wanted every person to essentially have, right, is something that is very important. He thought that that was methodologically the most important thing about science. Just as a chess grandmaster, right, has a view of the chessboard which is very different from me, who is a novice. Similarly, every person should essentially have the right perspective, sharpen the perceptual faculties so that he can see things beyond his immediate reach. And I think those two aspects, I think both the individual and the societal, were very important for Sri Sri Thakur.
Brilliant. I think especially the concept of interinterestedness or interconnectedness is so powerful and so profound. I really like the example of the hand believing that it has no existence outside the human body, and it's there at all times to take care of the human body. And it believes that it is in its own interest that it should do that. This is a powerful concept. Viewers, I think this is a very interesting discussion that's going on, and we are listening to Professor Sutanu Chakraborty, professor at IIT Chennai. We will continue the discussion. I'm going to ask the last question to him, and thereafter, after that, we'll open up this platform to all of you for you to ask questions. Professor Chakraborty, I think we talked about science, we talked about spirituality, and we also know about the human excellence, human intelligence. Today, we keep hearing about human intelligence versus artificial intelligence. And when we talk about the latest developments in the space of science, especially artificial intelligence has taken the center stage. It's believed to be revolutionizing the It's going to revolutionize our personal, familial, social, business lives. Now, the question is, what are your observations on the recent developments, especially artificial intelligence, and what possibilities this can open up for our individual and social lives?
Okay, thank you again for the question, which is supposed to be closer home because I'm supposed to be working in areas related to AI. Uh, so again, when it comes to AI, just like any other science, I think we need to keep reminding ourselves of the normative focus of Sri Thakur, that it has to be used for human good and human well-being, and for improving the sense of well-being that we can offer to people. And it is easy to lose focus because we have seen multiple instances in history where even Albert Einstein regretted some of the things that he had done. So he had been practicing science, but he also came out and wrote a letter to the president, I think, and he regretted later on that I could have avoided writing that letter. Uh, and that led to a lot of developments in the Second World War and so on, as most of you know. So it's very important to keep that broad focus in mind. The second aspect of it, and we have seen multiple ways in which AI can actually make our lives easier. We are all, we are having this conversation, and AI is playing a big role in day-to-day lives. It's increasingly getting, producing a lot of impact in healthcare in particular, and in many other areas. So if something can be done to essentially create a prosthetic arm or help someone which is visually challenged, and so on, all of these are great things that that are increasingly looking possible. But at the same time, there is also a bit of hype around AI. In some sense, we are beginning to believe that we are approaching human intelligence. And my personal observation is that we are still far from it. So there are certain set of tools and techniques we have come up, and these are good engineering innovations. But just like the same set of tools and techniques that we use to kind of climb a tree cannot take us all the way to the moon. Similarly, there are grand unsolved problems in science, and we need to fix them to essentially make any headway in the fundamental problems. So just to give you an example, as Mr. Mahapatra is speaking to me, I am processing it. So I must be having some memory, and whatever he's saying is like is a linguistic construct which gets into my memory. So whatever he says is like a seed which fertilizes the soil, which is my memory, and some life form emerges, which is meaning, right? Only when my memory is adequately equipped to process what he's saying can it make any sense to me. And that's why this germination of life form is something that is equivalent to understanding in some way. But in fundamental sciences, we still don't have an understanding of what it takes to make something living, or more fundamentally, as Sri Thakur pointed out, whether there is any distinction between the living and the non-living at all. So these are unresolved questions in science, and unless we actually have answers to them, we cannot really think about making impressive headways in trying to even understand so engineering improvements are one thing, but understanding the science of it so that we can go all the distance is quite another. So just like, even if you take a simple example, if I take a building, if I take a brick, then we say that the brick might be aware of the design of the building, but maybe not to the same extent that the cell of a human body is aware of the design of the system, because the cell has in it, every cell has in it the genetic code which captures the design in a condensed form maybe of the entire whole. So each component of the system essentially has something to do about the design of the whole. And this is what we call the holographic model or whatever, right? And we essentially still have systems which essentially exist as isolated entities. Sometimes we call reductionist way of looking at things. For example, we break things into parts and try to understand it, but that obviously is an incomplete picture. Just like you can take a joke and dissect it into parts, but just like you can dissect a frog and you understand something about the anatomy, but then the frog stops jumping. Similarly, if you dissect the frog into parts, into the humor into parts, then we stop laughing at it. So exactly the same thing is happening in AI as well, that we are taking bits and pieces, but we are not able to come to the whole, the understanding, which again Sri Thakur was very emphatic in kind of, he actually provided very interesting directions towards the study of consciousness, especially this synthetic thing that we become conscious only if we have some impulses from the outside world. And those are, I think, there is a book called The Bigyan Vibhuti, which contains uh, some of these clues, right, which someone has to take and then progress maybe in certain interesting directions, keeping the normative focus of Sri Thakur in mind. But that's one part of it, which is to say that there are a lot of problems that are unsolved, and we kind of don't. The other thing, which I think I'll conclude with, is an observation that is important, which is we have a lot of information these days, and there needs to be a distinction between the how and the what. Right, so we have a lot of information about how to get things done, about know-how of things. Thanks to YouTube, thanks to internet, we have access to all of that. Very fast access, something that was unimaginable maybe 30 years back or so on. But at the same time, what we do not have from the web, what we do not have from all the advances that have happened, is a direction relating to what to do. Right, and this is primarily where the ideal is needed in life, that what actually has to be done. And the rest is about how to put the resources together to kind of make that happen. But what exactly is the purpose of our life? What exactly needs to be done? And then I think science and technology can play an important role in the how aspect of it. It will be unfortunate if we take science and technology and expect it to give us directions to the answers relating to the what and why I should be doing what I should be doing. And I think I'll conclude there.
Absolutely, absolutely brilliant. So well articulated by Professor Chakrabarti. Very in a very lucid manner and very simple and practical manner, you have talked about the essence of science and spirituality. We'll continue the discussion now. I will open it up for the audience to ask questions. So I would request my team at the back end to bring up the questions on the screen so that we would request Professor Chakrabarti to answer some of them. Depending on how much time we have, we can probably take about a few questions. I think we have the first question on the screen.
Yeah, so there is a question about the relation between existentialism, science, and spiritualism. So I just want to kind of make an observation that existentialism, from the point of view of philosophers who have actually advocated existentialism to the best of my knowledge, has essentially focused on the notion of existence. But I think the concept of being and becoming, right, which is so central to understanding the role of why we are the way we are and our interrelationship to the rest of the world, becomes meaningful only when we have a love association with a living ideal. So existentialism as a philosophical discipline, I think, is often confused with existentialism in the way Sri Thakur meant it, at least from my limited knowledge. And I think the primary distinction about Sri Thakur is that he made the concept of existentialism, or the fact that things should exist and grow, operational, right? So suppose someone looks at the notion of existence and actually thinks of it as a sacrifice, then existentialism becomes very dry. And this is one of the problems that Western philosophies have actually faced. Kierkegaard, for example, was an existentialist, and several others actually. And we find that dryness. Many of these existentialists actually led the later half of their lives in quite a bit of agony. And what Sri Sri Thakur has done is given an objective to all the so-called sacrifices. So when one has a love center, a center for attachment, then it becomes meaningful to invest things that promote being and becoming. And that's precisely what Sri Sri Thakur has provided. And without that center, I think the philosophy has the risk of running quite dry. And I don't, as I think I kind of spent some time on, I don't think there is actually any conflict whatsoever between science and spiritualism in that sense. But this is all, as far as I know, I could be limited in my understanding.
Can we have the next question?
Okay, so this is from our respected Rajuda. I think the earlier question was from a respected person, his brother as well. I know both of them quite well. So please accept my pranam. How the AI can be used in the database. So I think there is tremendous potential to, I think, use AI technologies, especially advancements in natural language processing, to essentially have this online library of Sri Sri Thakur and make effective and allow for effective search on that. So many a time we essentially are looking for some message of Sri Sri Thakur, but because of different reasons, we are not able to access it. Now that we have also a lot of literature in terms of the dictionary, for example, which Acharya Dev Sri Sri Dada has taken so much of interest in, Shabda Ratna Kosh, we also can provide essentially different ways of accessing that same information, even if people are not using the same words to describe it, and we can provide access to that. So there's a lot of semantic search, so-called semantic search, that's possible. There's also this challenge of search over Bengali literature, and I think all of these are very important ways of making AI useful for the next generation and making the literature accessible to people, I think. And I mean, there could be other applications. I think this question is related to literature, but AI can have other applications in networking and so on as well. Yeah.
Great. We can have the next question on the screen.
Yeah. So this is from the Questers Club. The principle of entropy says that the world is moving from order to disorder. Is spirituality a return journey? Yeah, supposed to be so, right? So all the effort that we make in our life is because we want things to be better, to assume some sense of purpose which it did not have before. Though, I mean, order and disorder could be relative, but it's surely to kind of bring in a sense of harmony in our inner being as well as in our outer being. The inner being could be the sense of harmony between our thoughts, words, and deeds. And that for any big talk we make about national integration. So Sri Sri Thakur was very emphatic on having an organic approach where things spread out from individual through family to the society at large. So definitely it's kind of trying to bring in more harmony so that we enjoy our little lives a lot more. Yeah.
Great. I think we have time for a couple of more questions. I request the team if there are more questions, you can bring them up on the screen. Yep, I think we have one more question, Professor Chakrabarti.
Yeah, so Riddhananda, regarding the connection between science and spirituality, do you think they equally influence each other? Yeah, I think they're not kind of, they don't have any sense of contradiction with each other. So they're not competing for places and they can meaningfully coexist, right? Again, science and spirituality are just terms, but I think The most important thing, I think, is the inner world of experiences. And to achieve that sense of consistency in the inner world of experiences, not in the language, not in how we express things, but to kind of move there, I think is the goal. And whatever, be it we call it science, whether we call it spirituality, whatever it takes us there, I think is a welcome move. So, yeah.
I think these are great questions. And today we're fortunate to have very eminent personalities in the audience. And and there's some very, very thought-provoking questions that we are receiving from them. I think it's a fantastic discussion. Uh, as we wait for the next question, I think here we are. I think we have one more question.
Yeah, so where does AI stop and natural intelligence take over in real life? Yeah, so as I said, I mean, in the real life as we see it today, I mean, we don't have AI still kind of intruding into natural intelligence realms. And our goal primarily is to make them complement each other in meaningful ways. So machines are great number crunchers. There are things that machines are very good at doing. There are several other things humans are actually great at. So just if you look at Google search engine, for example, it's great at doing some number crunching and giving you some list of 20 odd results which are relevant for you. But the final job of selecting which is actually meaningful to your query is done by you, right? Google is actually making you do the hard work. And we think Google is doing all the work, so that's not right. So this whole idea that humans and machines should participate, should complement each other in getting things done, is, I think, an important storyline as of now, right? With certain progress in fundamental level of understanding, there could be differences. There could be some penetration of intelligence into certain things we are currently accustomed to doing. But again, I think there would still be this separation. And I think, yeah, the goal essentially is really about making them complement each other rather than making one, I mean, conflict another or compete with respect to another. So that's what I think.
I liked what you said. I think the search engine is making us work harder and not really making things easier for us. I think there is one more question. No, I think there is a response from Shivanand Prasad ji that he has really appreciated you for your response. Professor Chakravarti, I think it was a fabulous discussion. Today we talked about science and spirituality. And this question, whether science and spirituality are complementary to each other, can they collaborate, can they converge, or are they contradictory to each other? I think these questions have really intrigued the human mind since times immemorial. I think, as you mentioned, science delves into the matter, spirituality delves into spirit, and you talked about Sri Thakur's literature immensely in this discussion, and I think Sri Thakur has emphatically said that spirit is an evolved state of the matter. Spirit, matter, and spirit are different stages of the same continuum. He says what you can see in your naked eye is the world, is the matter, but what lies behind the matter is the spirit. That's the cause of everything. Behind the gross, there is the fine. Behind the fine, there is the finer. Behind the finer, there is the finest. Behind that is the prime cause from which everything has originated. Everything has evolved through the through this process of evolution. So what you see today is the effect of the evolution that has started from the supreme source. That's why I think I did see a mention of Sri Thakur's quote by Sudhanand, Dr. Sudhanand Prasad, And he said, he has quoted Sisi Thakur. He says, to ignore the source is to deprive of resources. Uh, Professor Chakravarti, thank you very much. I think it was a brilliant discussion, absolutely insightful. And we are really fortunate to have somebody like you who is an exponent in both science and spirituality. And it was a delight to listen to you today. Absolutely insightful. Lot of takeaways for all our audiences today. And I would like to thank you profusely for being with us today. I would like to thank our audience for, you know, listening to the panelists today, asking very, very interesting, intelligent questions, and making this discussion absolutely engaging and participative. Um, Dear audience, dear friends, we have these sessions every month. On the second Saturday of the month, we bring in an eminent personality who brings in immense wisdom, who helps us find answers to questions that we haven't found yet. Today we had Dr. Chakrabarti, and it was a fantastic session. I would request you that stay tuned, follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, YouTube, and other social media handles, and we will notify you about programs in the future. Give us your feedback about the session today, what you liked about this session, what you want us to do more, and this will make the sessions even more meaningful in the future. With this, we'll sign off today. Thank you very much once again, and goodbye, and good night, Professor Chakrabarti. Namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thanks to everyone for sparing time for this. And I would obviously like you to excuse me for any lapses on my part. Thank you.
That's so nice and humble on your part. Thank you so much. Thank you. With this, we come to the end of